While many additional sources might be cited in support of the importance of this complexity-theoretic and integrative perspective, let me just offer just one. In his 2009 book, The Global Deal, Climate Change and the Creation of a New Era of Progress and Prosperity, economist Lord Nicholas Stern of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the London School of Economics unambiguously asserts at the beginning of Chapter 1 the following, quote, "The two greatest problems of our times, overcoming poverty in the developing world and combating climate change, are inextricably linked. Failure to tackle one will undermine efforts to deal with the other. Ignoring climate change would result in an increasingly hostile environment for development and poverty reduction. But try to deal with climate change by shackling growth and development would damage, probably fatally, the cooperation between developed and developing countries that is vital to success." Unquote. Again, how that synergy and cooperation might be realized in the context of planetary boundaries is so rich with journalistic opportunity for sustained exploration and reportage that it seems almost beyond belief that such considerations remain completely outside the purview of conventional public affairs media. And because the choices of the grand challenge categories or tectonic categories, which will define how the Imperative Report will frame and characterize the unique locus of attention for its reportage, are in reality thematically rich and extensively linked nested hierarchies, drilling down more deeply into each of them will likely reveal numerous other thematic subcategories similarly deserving of sustained and interlinked reportage and cross-disciplinary coverage, exploring their implications on the larger category of which they may be a part. One promise of the Imperative Report is that it will serve to illuminate one of the greatest challenges of governance in complex systems, how they lead to the systemic emergence of novelty. Novelty which may elsewhere be either constructive or threatening. The implications of this can be quite profound precisely because decision-making tends to be made on narrow, siloed criteria, often with quite disappointing and even perversely exacerbating results, rather than the intended corrective results expected and intended. And though far from exhaustive, other sources for exploring such thematic categories might include the World Future Society, the Foresight Institute, the Santa Fe Institute, and again the Davos World Economic Forum network of global agenda councils. And because the subject of implication and causal overlap between thematic tectonic categories or grand challenge categories or subcategories just cited is so important to the dynamic and creative manner in which the Imperative Report is intended to operate, and so central to its unique value in fulfilling the larger social informational mandate, further comment on this is appropriate precisely because it is something generally not recognized as journalistically germane. An important property of complex adaptive systems, such as biological, social, and economic systems, as opposed to merely arbitrarily complicated mechanical systems like a Swiss watch or a computer CPU chip, relates to their dynamic and generally highly nonlinear nature, and the tendency for the boundaries and constraints operative between their constituent components to be malleable, if not dynamically labile, in the very nature of their functional identities. This reality entails a level of interaction among these ostensibly distinct constituents which can be very extensive and highly generative, often in surprising and unanticipated ways. Failure to understand this, and designing our institutions, including journalistic, and their operational procedures on the tacit but deeply flawed epistemological and ontological presumption that they're merely mechanical cogs of a larger machine system is largely responsible for failures in both properly defining risk analysis, timely anticipation and recognition of emergent problems or opportunities, and our continued failure to adapt and enhance our governance processes and the operational resilience of our institutions and their procedures. The latter concern being a major theme of the important title by Professor Homer Dixon cited above. Further, as evidenced by the increasingly pervasive inter- and transdisciplinary nature of much of the most important and exciting research occurring in the natural sciences and technology, for example, nanotechnology, biomedical, material science, mesoscopic physics, etc., this theme of cross-disciplinary approach to anticipating and preventing systemic failures has very important but largely unrealized implications for journalistic and public affairs content generation. And this deserves to be said with acute emphasis, because the core idea of predefining the grand challenge or tectonic categories driving the future, but constrained within the planetary boundaries construct as the unique operational vision of the imperative report should absolutely not be construed as implying that the reportage will be static and rigidly siloed to those categories per se. Indeed, one of the most exciting aspects of this vision is inviting and encouraging systematic investigation and reportage about the extent, nature, and implications of the interactions and feedback among and between these categories. That's where the generative properties emerge. In short, this complexity or systems theoretic orientation adds a very significant new dimension to the long historic who, what, when, where, why procedures and ethos of conventional reactive topicality and incident-oriented journalism, with additional related questions pertaining to intersystemic dependencies, amplifying and balancing feedback structures, appropriateness or balance-imbalance of incentive structures, agonist-antagonist linkages and their consequences, questions pertaining to what is or needs to happen to be consistent with, say, planetary boundaries, how the subject of a report affects the damping or amplifying feedbacks among the subsystems of which it is a part, etc. That is not merely important in its own right, it is utterly indispensable if we are ever to have a quote-unquote free press which remotely fulfills the mandate envisioned by America's founders in terms of maintaining a truly informed citizenry and electorate, but also in terms of maintaining an open society. Something which is not remotely satisfied by a journalistic environment characterized by obsessively fixating on the quote-unquote talking points of two political parties whose constraints on obsessively fixating on the talking points of two political parties whose constraints on how issues are framed are revealed as virtual farcical caricatures by comparison with the vastly richer, more subtle, and more complex palette which comes alive in this vision. In a very real sense, what these considerations help to illuminate is something which conventional journalistic practice is not structured to address. That is, complexity is not merely some abstract but inert meta-property, but a real, dynamic, driving thing, as it were, in itself. And failure to recognize the special obligations and demands that this reality places on any practices of journalism which take seriously its larger social mandate in sustaining open, democratic societies is a huge oversight of pedagogy, practice, and opportunity. While there are other news and public affairs venues that are oriented toward providing redress for underreported stories or stories subject to more or less tacit censorship due to the inconvenient truth problem of being in some manner politically or economically, corporately, etc., incorrect. Sources often dismissed as fringe in spite of some which may manifest standards of content, substance, and journalistic integrity, surpassing what is on display in the hyped, overproduced fare appearing in network or cable prime time. Even these may often reflexively fall victim to the same two deep and closely related oversights, which visibly hide in plain sight in major media reportage. More specifically, I am referring to thinking in terms of story, singular, thematically siloed, and usually incident and crisis related, and the absence of sustained continuity of coverage. Coverage beyond the quote-unquote incident or crisis. But when one begins to think in terms of the tectonic categories, the grand challenge categories, of driving influence cited above, these are not stories per se, coverage of which is exhausted in a report installment or two. These are more like universes begging to be explored, and not merely explored according to rigid thematic silos, but also in terms of how they interpenetrate and are linked. And exploration implies sustained continuity of attention and coverage as they unfold over time. And it needs to be added that the Imperative Report project defies the conventional wisdom that, quote-unquote, the public is not interested in challenging substantive content. In fact, this project is predicated on the opposite presumption, on the instinct that there is a vastly underserved market, if you will, and comprised not just of academics and professional policy wonks, but of a broad array of the intelligent, general lay public, perhaps especially exemplified by the mass of quote-unquote cultural creatives profiled in the work of Paul Ray and Sherry Ruth Anderson, who sense that we live in a time that is anything but business as usual, where not only the new solutions are needed, but where new modes of framing and exploring both what the real problems are, but also what an integrative and systems analytic approach to possible solution options would entail. And this brings us full circle back to the choice of the title, the Imperative Report, and what fundamentally it aspires to achieve. It may be useful to seek to finally crystallize the broader objectives of the Imperative Report by placing them in the context of passages from two incisive books, one by MIT sociology professor Richard Sinnett, and he notes in his important and very subtle book, The Culture of the New Capitalism, quote, "Democracy requires that citizens be willing to make some effort to find out how the world around them works," unquote. And again, even more recently, University of Illinois professor of communications Robert W. McChesney enumerates 4 crucial criteria for defining what a healthy journalism should be and should provide in his book, Digital Disconnect, and the 4th could hardly be more on point. Quote, "Such journalism addresses not only the transitory concerns of the moment, but also challenges that loom on the horizon. It must translate important scientific issues accurately into lay language. These issues cannot be determined primarily by what people in power are talking about. Journalism must provide the nation's early warning system so problems can be anticipated, studied, debated, and addressed before they grow to crisis proportions," unquote. In the former case, it is the aim of the Imperative Report to inspire, facilitate, and be in service of such citizen efforts. And in the latter instance, it is to be a venue conceived to provide precisely such content through an integrative and systems perspective, but with an orientation that is global in nature and not merely national. To be continued.